The egg donation paperwork promised anonymity, but when she arrived for the final procedure, the vampire king himself waited in the sterile white room. What no one told her, he'd been tracking her lineage for decades, and the contract she'd signed wasn't for money, it was a blood pact. Maya Chen's fingers trembled against the cold metal handle of the consultation room door as she realized it wouldn't budge. The man who called himself Kieran Valdris sat with impossible stillness in the medical chair, his pale hands folded over documents that seemed to shimmer with their own light. The sterile white room felt smaller now, the fluorescent bulbs casting shadows that shouldn't exist. His eyes held depths she couldn't measure, ancient and patient as winter lakes. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries, each word deliberate and formal, as if he were addressing a royal court rather than a broke college student who'd come here to sell her eggs for rent money. He explained that her rare O-negative blood wasn't just medically valuable, but supernaturally significant, a genetic marker that combined with her maternal Celtic lineage to create something he'd been searching for across decades. Maya's grandmother had fled County Cork in 1962, but she hadn't been running from poverty or politics. She'd been carrying secrets that stretched back generations, a bloodline promise made to beings her family called the Old Ones. The contract Maya had signed 3 weeks ago wasn't standard medical paperwork. Hidden beneath the modern legal language, written in ink that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at it, were symbols that predated any law she understood. Runic script that bound not just her eggs, but her essence to an agreement her ancestors had made when Ireland starved and desperate families sought protection from powers beyond human comprehension. The vampire king rose from the chair with fluid grace, moving to a cabinet filled with instruments that hummed with unnatural energy. He withdrew a folder thick with photographs and documents, spreading them across the examination table like evidence at a trial. Maya saw pictures of women who shared her features, stretching back through decades. Her great-grandmother standing beside a man who looked exactly like Kieran. Her grandmother as a young woman, signing papers in what appeared to be the same room where Maya now stood trapped. The realization hit her with physical force. She'd been guided here through careful manipulation that spanned her entire life. The scholarship that had brought her to New York, the financial aid that had kept her enrolled, even the fertility clinic recommendation from her student counselor. All of it orchestrated by a being who'd been watching her family for longer than she'd been alive. Kieran explained the curse with matter-of-fact precision that made her blood freeze. 500 years ago, his bloodline had been punished for breaking an oath to protect, rather than prey upon humanity. The consequence was sterility, a slow extinction that would eventually claim not just him, but the entire supernatural balance he represented. Only a willing descendant of the original pact makers could restore his fertility, but the ritual required more than just genetic material. It demanded presence, consent, and the activation of bonds written into the very fabric of supernatural law. Maya's presence in this room had triggered the final phase of an agreement she'd never known she'd inherited. The click of the door's ceiling echoed like a gunshot in the sterile space. Security cameras in the corners blinked from green to red, their mechanical eyes tracking her movements with predatory focus. Medical equipment that had seemed normal minutes before now hummed with energy that made her skin crawl, monitors displaying readings that couldn't possibly be measuring anything human. When Maya caught her reflection in the polished metal of a surgical instrument, she saw something that stopped her breath. A faint runic symbol glowed on her forehead, visible only in the vampire king's presence, marking her as bound to agreements she'd never made but couldn't escape. The symbol pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing brighter as Kieran moved closer, responding to proximity like some supernatural GPS system that tagged her as his property. She pressed herself against the sealed door, feeling the cold metal through her thin sweater. The room smelled wrong now. Antiseptic mixed with something older and earthier, like soil and iron and the deep places under stones. Kieran's explanation continued with relentless logic. The curse had been precise in its requirements, demanding not just willing participation, but informed consent from a bloodline that had originally bargained for protection during Ireland's darkest years. Her family had survived the famine because they had agreed to provide this service when called upon, trading future generations' freedom for present survival. The debt had finally come due, collected not through force but through careful manipulation that had brought her here believing she was making a simple financial transaction. Maya's mind raced through alternatives, escape routes, legal options that might free her from supernatural contracts she'd never understood. But Kieran's next words shattered those hopes with surgical precision. The blood pact was already active, triggered by her signature on documents she'd read but not truly comprehended. Whether she cooperated willingly or fought every step, the supernatural binding would complete itself within the lunar month. Her only choice was whether to face the consequences as a partner or a prisoner. The runic symbol on her forehead burned brighter as her fear spiked, responding to emotional states like a supernatural mood ring that advertised her terror to anyone who could read its ancient language. Maya realized that her reflection in every metal surface now showed the mark, a glowing brand that proclaimed her status as bound to the Vampire King's bloodline restoration. She thought of her cramped apartment, her roommate Zoe probably wondering why she was late from what should have been a simple medical appointment, her student loans, her part-time job at the campus coffee shop, her ordinary human life that suddenly seemed as distant as a half-remembered dream. All of it had been illusion, a carefully maintained facade while supernatural forces positioned her exactly where they needed her to be. The Vampire King moved with liquid grace to a window that revealed not the busy Manhattan street she expected, but a view of gardens and grounds that stretched impossibly far, as if the building existed in space folded away from normal geography. Maya understood that escape wouldn't be as simple as finding another door or breaking a window. She was no longer in the world she knew, but in a place where different rules applied and ancient agreements held more power than modern law. When Kieran turned back to face her, his expression held something she hadn't expected to see. Not cruelty or hunger, but a bone-deep weariness that spoke of centuries spent watching his bloodline slowly die. He'd orchestrated this moment not from malice but from desperate necessity, a being facing extinction who'd found the one path to survival that didn't require him to become the monster his kind had once been. The weight of that knowledge settled over Maya like a blanket she couldn't throw off. She wasn't just trapped by supernatural law, but by the moral complexity of a situation where her freedom might mean the death of an entire bloodline that had chosen protection over predation. The runic symbol continued to pulse on her forehead, a countdown timer marking the beginning of changes she couldn't yet imagine but could no longer avoid. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Maya's voice cracked as she demanded her freedom, but Kieran's response shattered any hope of simple escape. The blood pact had activated a supernatural tether that bound them within a mile of each other for the next lunar month, 28 days that stretched before her like a prison sentence written in starlight and ancient law. If either of them strayed beyond that invisible boundary, both would experience psychic backlash described in terms that made her stomach clench with dread. Searing pain that would build until it drove them to madness, supernatural agony designed to enforce compliance with agreements their ancestors had sealed in blood and desperation. Kieran offered her accommodations in his penthouse, luxury that would ease the physical discomfort of their enforced proximity, but Maya chose rebellion over comfort. She would return to her cramped student apartment, test the limits of this supernatural leash, and find a way to break free from bonds she'd never agreed to forge. The Vampire King nodded with what might have been respect, understanding that her defiance came not from stupidity, but from strength that refused to be crushed by circumstances beyond her control. He provided her with a black card that would cover any expenses she incurred, a gesture that felt more like obligation than generosity, payment for cooperation he couldn't command but desperately needed. Maya left the clinic feeling the weight of invisible chains, stepping into Manhattan sunshine that seemed dimmer than it had hours before. The supernatural bond manifested as a golden thread only she could see, stretching between her heart and some point behind her where Kieran remained. As she walked toward the subway, the thread grew taut, then began to burn with increasing intensity as distance stretched their connection toward its breaking point. 3 blocks from the clinic, the pain became unbearable, forcing her to stop and catch her breath against a building wall, while tourists flowed around her like water around a stone. The thread pulsed with urgent warning, pulling her back toward the Vampire King with insistence that made her teeth ache. Maya turned around and felt immediate relief as the tension eased, the golden cord relaxing into a gentle curve that connected her to powers she was only beginning to understand. Her apartment building felt different when she finally reached it, the familiar lobby somehow smaller and shabbier than she remembered. Zoe was waiting in their shared kitchen, concern written across her features, as she took in Maya's pale complexion and shaking hands. Maya invented a story about medical tests and delayed results, but her roommate's sharp eyes caught details she couldn't explain away. The mysterious black sedan that had followed her from the clinic now sat parked across the street, its tinted windows reflecting the building like dark mirrors that watched without blinking. Zoe pointed out the car's presence with growing alarm, noting how it had arrived shortly after Maya and remained stationary while other vehicles came and went. Maya felt the weight of supernatural surveillance pressing down on her ordinary life like storm clouds gathering before thunder. That night, she searched through boxes her grandmother had left her, documents and photographs she'd never bothered to examine closely. Hidden among immigration papers and faded family pictures, she found letters written in her grandmother's careful handwriting that mentioned obligations to the night court and promises that must be kept by future generations. The words were coded in language that seemed innocent unless you knew what to look for. References to debts paid in service and protection earned through sacrifice. Maya read by lamplight until her eyes burned, piecing together a family history that revealed her entire life had been shaped by supernatural agreements made before her birth. Her grandmother hadn't fled Ireland, but had been sent to America as a living insurance policy, carrying bloodline potential that would mature in her descendants like a savings account earning interest across decades. Maya's mother had died young, never knowing the full truth of their heritage, leaving Maya to face alone the collection of debts she'd inherited along with her genetics. The golden thread pulsed steadily in her peripheral vision, a constant reminder that freedom was an illusion and that somewhere across the city, the Vampire King waited with patience born of centuries. The next morning brought Kieran into Maya's workspace with the inevitability of sunrise. She was pulling espresso shots at the campus coffee shop when he entered, and the entire atmosphere shifted like air pressure dropping before a storm. Conversations quieted as customers sensed something different about the tall, pale man who moved with predatory grace between crowded tables. Maya's hands shook as she watched him approach the counter, knowing that her co-workers and regular customers were about to witness an interaction that would shatter the careful normalcy she'd tried to maintain. But Kieran's approach was subtle, respectful, designed to minimize disruption rather than create a scene. He ordered a simple black coffee and waited patiently while she prepared it, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. When their fingers touched during the exchange, Maya felt electricity that had nothing to do with static buildup, supernatural energy that confirmed their bond while reminding her of powers that operated beyond human understanding. He stayed for an hour, reading a newspaper with ancient eyes that had witnessed the events it reported as they unfolded across decades. Other customers found themselves drawn to his table, starting conversations they couldn't later explain, sharing stories with a stranger who listened with attention that felt both flattering and unsettling. Maya watched him work subtle influence over her everyday world, demonstrating abilities she was only beginning to comprehend while never crossing lines that would expose his true nature. When the lunch rush ended and they could speak privately, Kieran made offers that revealed the scope of his influence over her life. Student loans that could disappear with a phone call, rent payments that would never again threaten her housing security, a future free from financial stress if she would cooperate with processes she still didn't fully understand. But more disturbing were his revelations about the past, the careful orchestration of events that had brought her to this moment, the scholarship that had made college possible, the apartment application that had been approved despite her limited credit history, even the fertility clinic recommendation that had led her into his web. Maya realized she'd been moving through a carefully constructed maze for years, guided by invisible hands toward a destiny chosen before her birth. The supernatural influence went deeper than financial manipulation, touching parts of her psyche she'd thought were entirely her own. The dreams that had drawn her to study ancient history, the unexplained attraction she'd felt toward certain symbols and artifacts, even her unconscious tendency to seek out quiet spaces during the full moon. All of it had been preparation for this moment, supernatural grooming that had shaped her preferences and instincts while leaving her unaware of the forces guiding her development. Kieran explained that successful bloodline bonding required not just genetic compatibility, but emotional and spiritual harmony, connections that couldn't be forced, but had to be cultivated across time like rare flowers that bloomed only under specific conditions. Maya felt violated by the depth of influence he'd wielded over her life, angry at discovering that choices she'd thought were her own had been shaped by supernatural manipulation she'd never detected. That evening brought visitors Maya hadn't expected, supernatural forces that shattered her apartment windows and filled her living room with the scent of old blood and ancient rivalry. Lady Seraphina arrived with elegant violence, leading a faction of vampires who claimed Kieran had forfeited his rights through deception and manipulation that violated supernatural law. They moved with inhuman speed, surrounding Maya before she could react, explaining in voices like silk over steel that her bloodline could serve their purposes just as well as Kieran's. The rival faction's ritual would bind her to their bloodline instead, transferring the fertility restoration to powers that had waited centuries for this opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Maya found herself at the center of supernatural politics she didn't understand, a prize to be won rather than a person with agency and choice. The golden thread connecting her to Kieran began to pulse with urgent warning as the rival vampires prepared to take her by force, their ritual requiring her physical presence regardless of her consent. Zoe emerged from her bedroom to find her apartment invaded by beings that moved like liquid shadow, her shocked screams adding human terror to supernatural conflict. Maya realized that her attempt to maintain normal life while bound to the Vampire King had endangered everyone she cared about, drawing innocent people into conflicts that could destroy them without thought or remorse. The apartment became a battlefield when Kieran arrived with speed that left afterimages in the air, supernatural combat that turned furniture into weapons and walls into obstacles to be shattered rather than barriers to be respected. Maya witnessed abilities that redefined her understanding of possible, watching vampires move faster than her eyes could track while wielding strength that could crush stone and bend metal like clay. The fight lasted minutes but left devastation that would take weeks to repair, furniture destroyed and walls cracked by forces that treated physical matter as inconvenient rather than immutable. When the violence ended with Lady Seraphina's faction retreating but not defeated, Maya faced a choice that would determine not just her future, but the safety of everyone in her orbit. She could stay and continue trying to live a normal life while supernatural forces fought over her bloodline, endangering Zoe and her classmates and anyone else who happened to be nearby when the next attack came. Or she could accept Kieran's protection, fleeing with him to safety that would mean abandoning the human life she'd fought so hard to build. Maya looked at her destroyed apartment, at Zoe's terrified face, at the evidence of powers that could erase human lives as easily as stepping on ants. The golden thread pulsed between her and Kieran like a heartbeat, reminding her that their bond was permanent, regardless of her choices about where to spend the remaining weeks of their supernatural tether. She chose protection, but with conditions that surprised the Vampire King with their steel and clarity. She would accept his help and flee to safety, but she demanded full truth about the supernatural world she'd been thrust into, complete honesty about the ritual that would restore his fertility, and genuine agency in decisions about her own body and future. Maya Chen was done being manipulated by forces she couldn't see, done accepting half-truths from beings who thought human understanding was optional. If she was going to be bound to the supernatural world, she would enter it with eyes open and will intact, not as a victim, but as a participant who insisted on respect, even from creatures who'd forgotten what it meant to treat humans as equals rather than resources. Maya's hands shook as she turned the brass key Kieran had given her, unlocking the mahogany door at the end of his penthouse's longest hallway. The room beyond took her breath away, not for its luxury, but for its impossible contents. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined every wall, filled with documents that chronicled her family's history in meticulous detail. Photographs spanning decades showed women who shared her features standing beside figures she now recognized as supernatural beings. Her great-great-grandmother posed with a man whose pale skin and timeless eyes marked him as vampire nobility. Her great-grandmother signed papers in what appeared to be a ritual chamber, surrounded by beings whose shadows fell wrong against candlelit walls. But it was the central display that stopped Maya's heart. A glass case held letters written in her grandmother's careful handwriting, addressed to Maya Elizabeth Chen in ink that had somehow known her name before she was born. The first letter bore a date from 1962, written the day her grandmother had boarded a ship bound for New York. Maya's fingers trembled as she lifted the aged paper, reading words that shattered everything she thought she knew about her family's history. Her grandmother hadn't fled Ireland in desperation. She'd been chosen, selected by the village elders who still remembered the old agreements, and sent to America as a living insurance policy for a debt that would eventually come due. The potato famine hadn't just starved bodies, but awakened supernatural predators who saw human suffering as opportunity for feeding. Maya's ancestors had faced a choice between starvation and protection, trading future generations' freedom for present survival in an agreement that bound their bloodline to serve as restoration for a vampire king who'd chosen mercy over hunger. The letter explained in devastating detail how her family had volunteered for this burden, understanding that one day a daughter would be called to fulfill an oath that would save both human and vampire lives. Maya's grandmother had carried this knowledge across the Atlantic, establishing a new life while preparing for the moment when supernatural debts would be collected. Every choice her family had made since arriving in America had been calculated to position Maya exactly where she needed to be when that moment came. The scholarships, the guidance toward genetic counseling programs, even her parents' decision to settle in New York rather than staying in Boston, where her grandmother's sisters had established their families. All of it orchestrated across generations to ensure Maya would have the education and opportunity to understand what was being asked of her when the time came. The second letter contained maps and genealogical charts that traced her bloodline back to Celtic druids who'd originally forged supernatural pacts to protect their people. Maya learned that her rare blood type wasn't an accident of genetics, but the result of careful breeding programs maintained by families who understood their role in supernatural balance. Her ancestors hadn't been victims, but active participants in agreements that required willing sacrifice from each generation to maintain peace between species that could easily destroy each other. The third letter revealed the power flip that changed everything Maya thought she understood about her situation. Her grandmother had negotiated terms that went far beyond simple fertility restoration. The Vampire King needed willing consent not just for the ritual's success, but because supernatural law demanded that human participants retain agency in all supernatural contracts. Maya's bloodline carried not just the genetic keys to breaking Kieran's curse, but the legal authority to renegotiate terms, modify agreements, or even void the contract entirely if she deemed the Vampire King unworthy of restoration. The power had always been hers. Every supernatural being who'd approached her family across the centuries had done so as supplicants, not masters, requesting rather than demanding cooperation from a bloodline that held unique leverage in immortal politics. Her grandmother's final letter contained the most shocking revelation of all. Maya wasn't just the descendant of willing participants, but the heir to a supernatural legal tradition that made her voice equal to any vampire council or immortal court. The ritual couldn't proceed without her full, informed consent, given freely after understanding all terms and consequences. If she chose to refuse, Kieran's bloodline would face extinction. But if she agreed, she could dictate conditions that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between human and supernatural communities. Maya found additional documents that outlined the full scope of her inherited authority. Her bloodline had negotiated not just protection during the Irish famine, but ongoing benefits that included supernatural security for their descendants, enhanced longevity that stopped just short of immortality, and the right to call upon vampire resources for any threat that endangered their family line. Her student loans had been mysteriously forgiven, not through Kieran's recent manipulation, but through supernatural financial instruments established by her grandmother decades ago. Her apartment's below-market rent was subsidized by trust funds her family had negotiated as part of their original agreement. Even her acceptance to prestigious universities had been smoothed by supernatural influence that had been protecting and positioning her since birth. The revelation that she'd been unconsciously benefiting from supernatural protection her entire life hit Maya with the force of physical blow. She'd never been struggling alone against financial hardship. Every scholarship, every opportunity, every stroke of luck that had kept her afloat had been the result of supernatural agreements her family had made to ensure her eventual success. She'd been raised in a carefully maintained bubble of protection that had hidden its own existence until the moment she needed to understand the full scope of what she'd inherited. Maya discovered a hidden compartment in her grandmother's desk, containing a will that left her not just family heirlooms, but legal documents that established her as the sole heir to supernatural contracts worth more than most corporations. Her signature on vampire agreements carried the weight of treaty obligations between species. Her consent or refusal could trigger diplomatic crises that would ripple through supernatural communities worldwide. The Vampire King hadn't been manipulating a helpless human, but courting a political equal whose bloodline gave her unique standing in immortal law. The final document Maya found changed everything she thought she understood about Kieran's desperation. Her grandmother had negotiated a sunset clause that would void all supernatural agreements if Maya chose to reject her inherited role before her 25th birthday. Kieran hadn't been operating from a position of strength, but racing against a deadline that would end his only chance for restoration. In 6 months, Maya would age out of the supernatural legal protections that bound her to ancestral agreements. Her choice to fulfill or reject the Vampire King's request had to be made soon. But unlike everything she'd believed since entering that sterile white room, the power to choose had always been entirely hers. Maya sank into her grandmother's chair, surrounded by evidence of a family legacy that made her not a victim, but a queen in a supernatural legal system she was only beginning to understand. The runic symbol on her forehead began to pulse with new intensity as the full weight of inherited power activated in response to her newfound knowledge. She wasn't trapped by supernatural law, but protected by it, holding authority that even ancient vampires couldn't override or ignore. The blood pact Kieran had described as binding became something entirely different when viewed through the lens of her true legal standing. She could modify its terms, demand additional protections for her family line, or negotiate benefits that would position her as an equal partner rather than a supernatural broodmare. The Vampire King's fate rested not in his ancient authority, but in her willingness to grant him mercy he had no power to compel. For the first time since discovering her supernatural entanglement, Maya smiled. Maya stood before towering bronze doors carved with symbols that predated any human civilization. Her reflection fractured in metal that had been forged when Rome was still a collection of villages. The Vampire Council chamber lay 3 levels beneath Manhattan's deepest subway tunnels, accessible only through passages that subway maps had never recorded and maintenance crews had never explored. The golden thread connecting her to Kieran pulsed with nervous energy as he led her through corridors lined with torches that burned without smoke, their flames casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. The chamber itself defied architectural possibility, a vast circular space that couldn't exist beneath the city's foundations, yet stretched away into darkness punctuated by 13 thrones arranged in a perfect circle. Each throne held a being whose age was measured in millennia rather than centuries. Vampires so ancient, their presence warped reality in subtle ways that made Maya's vision blur at the edges. The council leader's voice resonated from everywhere at once, words that bypassed her ears and spoke directly to her bones as she was commanded to present herself for questioning about supernatural legal matters that would determine not just Kieran's fate, but the balance of power between species that humanity didn't know existed. Maya had prepared for this moment by studying her grandmother's documents, learning the protocols and procedures that governed supernatural legal proceedings. But preparation felt inadequate when facing beings who remembered the fall of Constantinople and had witnessed the rise and collapse of empires that existed only in history books. Each council member carried agenda written in centuries of accumulated grievance and alliance, their questions probing not just the validity of her blood pact with Kieran, but her understanding of consequences that rippled through supernatural communities worldwide. Counselor Augustine, whose pale features held the cold perfection of marble statuary, questioned Maya about her family's original agreement with systematic precision that felt more like surgical dissection than legal inquiry. He wanted to establish whether her ancestors had understood the full implications of their bargain, whether consent given during desperate circumstances could be considered truly voluntary, and whether supernatural law should recognize contracts made between beings of vastly unequal power and knowledge. His real agenda became clear through careful questioning that revealed his faction's preference for Kieran's continued sterility, viewing the Vampire King's eventual fade from power as beneficial for supernatural stability they'd spent centuries establishing. Counselor Vesper approached from the opposite direction, her questions designed to establish Maya's legal competence and emotional readiness for restoration rituals that required more than simple genetic compatibility. She probed Maya's understanding of vampire reproduction's impact on supernatural balance, explaining how immortal fertility affected population dynamics that humanity couldn't comprehend. Too many vampires created feeding pressures that risked exposure through increased predation, while too few threatened supernatural community stability through power vacuums that invited chaos from less civilized supernatural species. Maya learned that vampire reproduction was regulated through council oversight that treated fertility as a privilege rather than a right, with restoration rituals requiring unanimous approval from beings who'd spent millennia maintaining careful balance between species survival and human protection. The questioning continued for hours that felt like days, each council member exploring different aspects of supernatural law that Maya was still learning to navigate. She faced inquiries about her willingness to accept partial vampiric transformation that would extend her lifespan beyond human norms, questions about her understanding of supernatural legal obligations that would bind her children and grandchildren to ongoing oversight, and demands that she demonstrate knowledge of council authority that superseded human law in all matters involving immortal community welfare. Maya's responses drew on her grandmother's letters and her own sharp intelligence, asserting her humanity while acknowledging supernatural legal frameworks she was only beginning to understand. But her most powerful moment came when she turned the questioning back on the council itself, demanding explanations for centuries of supernatural manipulation of human affairs that had positioned her family as unwilling participants in immortal politics. The chamber fell silent as Maya challenged beings who hadn't been questioned by mortals in living memory, her voice carrying authority inherited from ancestors who'd negotiated with supernatural powers as equals rather than supplicants. She pointed out that vampire survival depended not just on careful population control, but on human cooperation that couldn't be sustained through deception and manipulation. If supernatural communities wanted stable relationships with humanity, they needed to treat human agency as legitimate, rather than viewing mortal will as obstacle to be circumvented through centuries of careful positioning. Her challenge shifted the chamber's energy as council members realized they faced not just another human caught in supernatural politics, but a representative of bloodlines that held unique legal standing in immortal law. The council's final questions focused on Maya's intentions regarding Kieran's restoration and her willingness to accept supernatural legal protections that would safeguard her family line against future exploitation. Maya's answers surprised everyone, including herself, as she outlined conditions that would fundamentally alter traditional vampire-human relationships. She would consent to the restoration ritual only if the council agreed to transparency protocols that ended centuries of hidden manipulation, established human representation in supernatural governance that affected mortal communities, and created legal frameworks that treated human participants as equal partners rather than renewable resources. The chamber erupted in discussion that ranged from outraged rejection to curious consideration as beings who'd never contemplated sharing power with mortals suddenly faced a human who held leverage they couldn't ignore or overcome. Maya's bloodline gave her unique authority in supernatural law, but her intelligence and courage transformed that authority into genuine power that forced ancient beings to consider possibilities they'd never imagined. The session ended without resolution as the council withdrew to deliberate decisions that would reshape supernatural governance for the first time in centuries, leaving Maya to wait for answers that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of human-vampire relations. Meanwhile, above ground, Lady Seraphina's revenge unfolded with digital precision that threatened to expose supernatural communities to human scrutiny they'd avoided for millennia. Edited footage of the supernatural fight in Maya's apartment appeared across social media platforms, carefully crafted to look like promotional material for an upcoming supernatural horror series that would explain away impossible feats of strength and speed as special effects rather than documented reality. But federal agencies with access to unedited security footage from surrounding buildings noticed discrepancies that triggered investigation protocols designed to identify genuine supernatural activity. Agent Rivera's approach came with professional courtesy that masked years of federal task force experience, monitoring supernatural communities. Her questions probing Maya's involvement with mysterious wealthy figures whose financial records didn't match their apparent lifestyles. Maya found herself navigating not just vampire politics, but federal investigation that treated her as potential witness, victim, or co-conspirator in activities that government agencies couldn't officially acknowledge but had been tracking for decades. The FBI's Supernatural Monitoring Division operated under classifications that didn't appear in any public documentation, their agents trained to identify immortal activity without revealing their knowledge to civilian oversight committees that lacked clearance for supernatural intelligence. Agent Rivera's questions revealed depth of federal knowledge that shocked Maya, detailed surveillance records that documented Kieran's activities across years of careful observation. Government agencies knew about vampire politics, territorial disputes, and reproductive regulations, but their policy remained non-interference unless supernatural activities threatened national security or public safety in ways that couldn't be contained through traditional law enforcement. Maya's case occupied a gray area that forced federal agents to balance supernatural community relations against human welfare protection in situations their training manuals hadn't anticipated. The media attention generated by Serafina's leaked footage created additional complications as conspiracy theorists began connecting Maya to mysterious wealthy figures whose influence extended far beyond any legitimate business empire. Online forums dissected security footage frame by frame, identifying impossibilities that special effects couldn't explain and tracking Maya's movements through financial records that showed supernatural support networks designed to remain invisible to casual investigation. Maya discovered that maintaining supernatural secrets required constant vigilance that became increasingly difficult as digital surveillance technologies made privacy impossible and social media amplified every inconsistency into potential exposure threat. Her normal life dissolved completely as federal agents monitored her communications. Vampire political factions tracked her movements, and online conspiracy theories turned her into a central figure in supernatural exposure scenarios that threatened centuries of carefully maintained secrecy. The debt from keeping supernatural secrets came due as Maya realized she could never return to human normalcy, her knowledge and involvement making her permanent bridge between species that had coexisted through mutual ignorance rather than understanding. Maya's apartment became a surveillance focal point where federal agents, vampire political operatives, and conspiracy theorists converged in digital and physical monitoring that made privacy impossible and safety precarious. She found herself at the center of conflicts between government agencies that wanted supernatural activities contained, vampire factions that demanded human cooperation without transparency, and online communities that sensed truth behind carefully constructed deceptions designed to maintain supernatural secrecy. The weight of inherited authority that had initially empowered Maya now became burden that connected her to conflicts spanning centuries of accumulated grievance between species that had never learned to coexist openly. Her choices would determine not just Kieran's fate and her own future, but the possibility of supernatural communities emerging from shadows they'd hidden behind, since humanity developed technologies that made concealment increasingly difficult to maintain. Maya's breath caught as Kieran led her through the narrow passage that connected the cathedral's basement to chambers that predated its construction by centuries. The hidden ritual site lay beneath what appeared to be an ordinary Irish Catholic church in Lower Manhattan, but the building's foundation stones had been transplanted from an ancient Celtic sacred site, carried across the Atlantic by immigrant families who understood that some power resided not in the place but in the stones themselves. The passage walls bore chisel marks that spoke of desperate nighttime excavation, work done by hands that trembled with secrecy and sacred purpose as they carved tunnels that connected supernatural heritage to American soil. The ritual chamber opened before them like a cathedral of its own, vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows that seemed to move independently of their torch flames. Celtic spirals and knots covered every surface in intricate carvings that pulsed with faint bioluminescence as Maya's presence awakened powers that had slumbered since the chamber's consecration. The floor was inlaid with symbols that formed complex geometric patterns, each intersection marked with precious stones that caught the light and held it like captured starfire. But what took Maya's breath away was the response of the chamber itself to her bloodline. Ancient magic, recognizing genetic keys that unlocked power her ancestors had helped bind into stone and metal centuries before her birth. The Celtic runes began to glow with increasing intensity as she moved deeper into the chamber, their light shifting from pale blue to brilliant gold that painted the walls with warmth that felt like welcome rather than warning. Kieran's presence triggered a different response as vampire symbols carved in darker stone activated with deep red luminescence that complemented, rather than competed with the Celtic magic. The chamber had been designed to accommodate both bloodlines, supernatural architecture that required dual activation to unlock its full potential. Maya realized she was walking through space that had been prepared specifically for this moment, consecrated ground that bound vampire and human magic in harmony that neither could achieve alone. The air itself seemed to thicken with potential as both sets of symbols reached full luminosity, creating an atmosphere charged with supernatural energy that made her skin tingle and her heartbeat synchronize with rhythms that predated human civilization. Maya stopped at the chamber's center, where a raised dais held an altar carved from single piece of black stone, its surface smooth as glass, yet warm to the touch like living flesh. The golden thread that connected her to Kieran pulsed with increasing urgency as he explained the ritual's requirements, his voice carrying reverence for ceremonies that restored not just fertility, but divine balance between mortal and immortal forces. But Maya had not come this far to surrender agency she had fought so hard to claim. She turned to face the vampire king, whose immortal beauty couldn't disguise the desperation that centuries of sterility had carved into his ancient soul. Her voice carried authority, inherited from ancestors who had negotiated with supernatural powers as equals, demanding terms that would preserve her humanity, while fulfilling obligations that bound their bloodlines together. She would consent to the ritual that would restore his fertility and bear the heir his bloodline required to survive, but she would do so as equal partner rather than supernatural broodmare, maintaining independence that no vampire law could override and retaining human agency that even council authority couldn't diminish. The negotiation that followed revealed the full scope of power dynamics that would govern their supernatural union. Maya's demands reshaping traditional vampire dominance into partnership that acknowledged human strength as complement rather than competition to immortal authority. Kieran's surprise at her assertiveness gave way to something that might have been relief as he realized the ritual would succeed not through coercion, but through willing collaboration between bloodlines that needed each other for survival. Maya's terms included protection for her family line against future supernatural manipulation, educational provisions that would prepare their children for the dual heritage they would inherit, and legal frameworks that would ensure vampire politics never again treated human will as obstacle to be circumvented through centuries of careful positioning. Her demands fundamentally altered traditional vampire-human relationships, establishing precedent that would ripple through supernatural communities for generations after the ritual's completion. But their negotiation was shattered by violence that exploded into the sacred chamber as Lady Seraphina's faction breached protections that had held for centuries. The rival vampires poured through passages that shouldn't have existed, their presence violating consecrated ground with such force that ancient wards screamed in frequencies that hurt Maya's bones. Seraphina herself moved with liquid grace that turned deadly as she launched herself toward the altar, where Maya stood frozen between competing claims on her bloodline. The chamber's response to invasion was immediate and devastating, as protective magic activated defenses that had waited generations for activation. But the rival faction's assault came with supernatural weapons, designed to overcome ancient protections through sheer overwhelming force. Kieran intercepted Seraphina's attack with speed that left after-images in the charged air, their collisions sending shockwaves through the chamber that cracked stones and sent precious gems scattering across the floor. The battle that erupted around Maya transformed the sacred space into supernatural war zone where immortal strength met immortal fury in combat that threatened to bring down the chamber's ancient ceiling. But the ritual had already begun. Triggered by the proximity of both bloodlines to the altar, during the full moon phase that occurred only once each generation. Maya felt power awakening within her as Celtic magic recognized its heir and vampire symbols responded to Kieran's presence, the chamber's accumulated energy seeking completion, regardless of violence that raged beyond the altar's protective circle. The fertility ritual required physical intimacy, charged with supernatural energy, but Maya discovered that her bloodline carried more than just genetic keys to vampire restoration. As Seraphina's faction pressed their attack against Kieran's desperate defense, Maya felt abilities awakening that transformed her from protected participant to active force in supernatural combat. The power that made her valuable to vampire bloodlines also gave her authority over vampire behavior, inherited magic that could compel truth from immortal lips, and enforce supernatural oaths through will alone, rather than ancient contracts. Her grandmother's letters had hinted at these abilities, but never fully explained powers that activated only when bloodline magic reached full potency during the restoration ritual itself. Maya's voice cut through supernatural combat with authority that froze every vampire in the chamber, her words carrying compulsion that bypassed immortal resistance through genetic dominance that vampire physiology couldn't ignore. The rival faction found themselves unable to advance against orders given by bloodline that held unique standing in supernatural law, their attack faltering as Maya's inherited authority asserted itself over vampire instincts that had been bred to recognize and obey her family's genetic legacy. Seraphina herself struggled against compulsion that felt like physical chains, her centuries of accumulated power meaningless against genetic keys that unlocked vampire submission protocols embedded in immortal DNA since the species' creation. Maya's newfound abilities allowed her to banish the rival factions with commands they couldn't resist, sending them from the sacred chamber through supernatural compulsion that demonstrated power her family had carried but never fully understood. But her authority went beyond simple banishment as she turned her inherited magic toward the ritual itself, reshaping ancient ceremonies to reflect partnership rather than dominance, equality rather than submission. The fertility restoration that had traditionally required vampire dominance over human participants became something entirely different under Maya's direction. Supernatural union that acknowledged human strength as essential rather than merely convenient for vampire survival. Kieran's shock at her transformation gave way to wonder as he realized the woman he'd thought to use had become partner whose power complemented rather than threatened his own immortal authority. The ritual's completion sent waves of supernatural energy through the chamber as Celtic and vampire magic merged in harmony that neither bloodline could achieve alone. Restoration magic that would echo through their descendants for generations yet to be born. Maya felt the change taking place within her own body, as vampire fertility magic activated genetic potential that would make her capable of bearing immortal children while retaining her essential humanity. But more importantly, she felt the fundamental shift in power dynamics that her assertion of inherited authority had created between vampire and human communities. The ritual chamber bore witness to the birth of new supernatural order, where human agency could no longer be dismissed as inconvenient obstacle to immortal politics, where bloodlines that had survived through willing sacrifice demanded recognition as equal partners in supernatural governance that affected both species. Maya's transformation from victim to partner had fundamentally altered not just her own fate, but the balance of power between immortal and mortal communities that had coexisted through deception and manipulation for too many centuries. As the ritual reached its climax, with supernatural energy that painted the chamber walls with light that would fade only after their children learned to walk, Maya knew she had become something unprecedented in vampire history. Not human turned vampire, but human elevated to immortal partner, whose authority derived from inherited power rather than granted transformation, whose strength came from genetic legacy rather than supernatural conversion. The vampire king beside her was no longer master, but equal, bound to her not through dominance, but through partnership that acknowledged human worth as fundamental rather than conditional. The sacred chamber held its breath as two bloodlines merged not in conquest but in collaboration that would reshape supernatural law for generations stretching into futures neither could fully imagine. Yet both had helped create through courage to demand better than the traditions that had brought them to this sacred space beneath foreign soil. Maya's consciousness returned slowly, like surfacing from deep water, where dreams and reality blurred at the edges of perception. The ritual chamber felt different now, its ancient stones humming with satisfied energy, as if sacred architecture itself had exhaled after holding its breath for centuries. Her body carried new awareness that went beyond enhanced senses, genetic modifications that bridged mortal and immortal physiology without sacrificing the essential humanity she'd fought to preserve. The supernatural longevity that now coursed through her veins promised decades beyond normal human lifespan while maintaining the emotional depth and moral flexibility that vampires lost when they transformed fully into immortal predators. Maya felt the change not as loss of humanity, but as expansion of potential, abilities that would allow her to navigate both worlds without belonging completely to either. Kieran watched her awakening with reverence that surprised them both, his restored fertility radiating through immortal aura, like warmth returning to frozen earth. But more profound than his physical restoration was the bond that had evolved between them during the ritual. Supernatural connection that had transformed from compulsion into partnership neither had expected. The golden thread that had once felt like chains now pulsed with shared purpose, linking them through choice rather than magical coercion. Maya tested her new abilities carefully, discovering that her enhanced strength and speed fell short of full vampire capability, while exceeding human limitations by margins that would make her formidable in conflicts spanning both communities. Her inherited power over vampire behavior had stabilized into authority that commanded respect, rather than enforcing submission, supernatural charisma that made even ancient immortals consider her opinions as valuable rather than merely tolerated. Together, they prepared to face the council with evidence that vampire-human cooperation could produce benefits neither species could achieve alone. The throne room felt different when they returned. 13 ancient beings regarding Maya not as curiosity, but as equal, whose authority derived from demonstrated power rather than granted privilege. The council's questions focused not on her right to participate in supernatural governance, but on her vision for relationships between species that had coexisted through mutual ignorance rather than understanding. Maya's proposals challenged centuries of vampire political tradition, suggesting transparency protocols that would end supernatural manipulation of human affairs, while establishing formal channels for cooperation that served both communities' interests. Her ideas included human representation in supernatural governance decisions that affected mortal populations, educational programs that would prepare hybrid children for their dual heritage, and legal frameworks that would treat supernatural human partnerships as legitimate rather than exotic exceptions to normal governance structures. The Council's acceptance came not through unanimous enthusiasm, but through recognition that Maya's unique position made her opposition more dangerous than her cooperation. Some members remained skeptical about sharing power with mortals they'd viewed as resources for millennia. But none could deny that her bloodline authority and demonstrated abilities made her voice impossible to ignore in supernatural legal proceedings. Maya's elevation to council advisory status marked the first time in recorded vampire history that human perspective would influence immortal political decisions, precedent that would reshape supernatural governance for generations, stretching into futures neither species had previously imagined. But her new status brought responsibilities that extended beyond supernatural communities as Agent Rivera approached them with federal task force proposals that would legitimize Maya's unique position. The FBI's Supernatural Monitoring Division needed consultants who could navigate immortal politics while maintaining human perspective on activities that threatened public safety without exposing supernatural communities to mass hysteria that would endanger both species. Maya's role as bridge between worlds made her ideal candidate for position that would use her abilities to prevent supernatural crimes while protecting the secrecy that kept vampire communities stable and human populations safe from truths they weren't prepared to handle. The federal consultation work offered Maya a legitimate career that satisfied her need for purpose while utilizing supernatural abilities in service of justice that transcended species boundaries. Kieran's support for her professional independence surprised federal agents who'd expected vampire territorial behavior, but their partnership had evolved beyond traditional supernatural possession into collaboration that acknowledged human agency as strength rather than inconvenience. The consulting position also provided cover for supernatural activities that required human-world interaction, official credentials that would explain Maya's presence at crime scenes involving immortal perpetrators, and her access to information that civilian investigators couldn't obtain through normal channels. Maya's first federal cases involved vampire territorial disputes that had spilled into human casualties, supernatural predators whose feeding patterns threatened exposure through excessive visibility, and immortal criminals who used enhanced abilities for activities that fell under federal jurisdiction regardless of their species. Her unique perspective allowed task force agents to understand motivations and methods that traditional law enforcement couldn't comprehend, while her vampire authority gave her tools for compelling cooperation from immortal suspects who viewed human legal systems as irrelevant obstacles to be circumvented through supernatural influence. The work provided satisfaction that combined her analytical skills with supernatural abilities, meaningful career that used her enhanced capabilities in service of justice that protected both human and vampire communities from predators that threatened the careful balance both species needed for survival. 6 months after the ritual, Maya's life had settled into routine that balanced supernatural responsibilities with human connections she refused to abandon, despite the increasing difficulty of maintaining relationships across species boundaries. Her friendship with Zoe had grown strained under the weight of secrets Maya couldn't fully share, half-truths that protected her roommate from supernatural politics while creating distance that hurt them both. Zoe sensed the changes in Maya, but couldn't understand the supernatural enhancement that made her friend stronger, faster, and more perceptive than human physiology should allow. Maya found herself editing conversations carefully, avoiding topics that might reveal the immortal world that now claimed half her attention while trying to maintain emotional connections that anchored her to the humanity she'd fought to preserve. The pregnancy that had resulted from the fertility ritual brought joy shadowed by complications that spanned both species' medical understanding. Maya carried the first vampire-human hybrid in centuries, child whose genetics would bridge supernatural and mortal communities in ways that neither species had experienced in living memory. Vampire physicians monitored supernatural aspects of fetal development, while human doctors tracked physical changes they couldn't fully explain. Collaborative medical care that reflected the dual nature of heritage their child would inherit. The hybrid pregnancy progressed faster than normal human gestation, while requiring supernatural nutrition that supplemented traditional prenatal care. Medical complexity that forced both species healers to expand their understanding of reproductive physiology that crossed species boundaries. Maya's enhanced longevity meant she would age more slowly than normal humans, genetic modification that promised decades of extended youth while carrying the cost of potentially outliving friends and family members who remained fully mortal. The supernatural aging process that would keep her young for centuries created temporal disconnect between her extended lifespan and the normal human relationships she treasured, philosophical burden that forced her to reconsider the meaning of friendship and love across vastly different lifespans. Her parents struggled to understand changes in their daughter that went beyond career success and mysterious wealthy boyfriend. Sensing transformation they couldn't identify while loving the woman Maya remained beneath supernatural enhancement. Maya faced the gradual realization that her choices had created permanent separation from fully human existence, bridge status that left her permanently between worlds rather than fully belonging to either. Kieran's own transformation brought challenges neither had anticipated, as restored fertility activated political pressures that had remained dormant during his centuries of sterility. Ancient vampire bloodlines that had written him off as evolutionary dead-end suddenly viewed his strengthened genetic line as threat to carefully maintained power balances they'd spent centuries establishing. His renewed ability to produce heirs made him target for assassination attempts by rivals who preferred vampire politics without the complications his restored bloodline would create. Supernatural violence that forced both Maya and their unborn child into protective protocols designed to prevent political murder. The quiet aftermath of their supernatural union revealed ongoing costs that would define the rest of their extended lives together, responsibilities and dangers that came with reshaping vampire-human relationships through partnership that challenged traditions both species had maintained for millennia. Maya's role as council advisor required her to mediate disputes between supernatural factions while maintaining human perspective that kept immortal politics grounded in moral frameworks that protected both communities from excesses that would endanger their coexistence. Her federal consulting work involved cases that grew more complex as supernatural criminals adapted to her involvement. Immortal predators who understood that their activities now faced investigation by someone who could navigate their culture while possessing authority to compel cooperation, they couldn't resist through traditional vampire hierarchy. The pregnancy progressed toward birth that would introduce unprecedented genetics into worlds that had never needed to accommodate children whose heritage spanned species boundaries that evolution had never intended to bridge, hybrid offspring whose existence would test every assumption both vampires and humans had made about the limits of supernatural mortal cooperation. Maya felt their child moving within her enhanced body as she stood in the ritual chamber that had become their private sanctuary, sacred space where vampire and human magic merged in harmony that their love had created through courage to demand better than the traditions that had once seemed immutable. The future stretched before them like uncharted territory, where their child would grow into abilities neither parent fully understood, hybrid heritage that would require new traditions and unprecedented protections in supernatural world that was still learning to accommodate human agency as equal rather than convenient. Maya's hand rested on her growing belly as she contemplated the revolution. They had begun through willingness to challenge supernatural law that had treated humans as renewable resources rather than irreplaceable partners. Transformation that would ripple through generations of vampire-human relationships that would follow the precedent their love had established through ritual that had changed both their species forever. Maya's labor lasted 18 hours that stretched across 2 sunsets, her enhanced physiology making childbirth both easier and more complex than normal human delivery. The private medical suite Kieran had arranged combined cutting-edge human technology with supernatural healing expertise, vampire physicians working alongside mortal doctors to monitor a birth that neither species had witnessed in their recorded histories. When Elena finally emerged into the world, her first cry carried harmonics that made the monitoring equipment resonate in frequencies beyond normal range, while her eyes opened to reveal irises that shifted between Maya's warm brown and something deeper that reflected light like polished obsidian. The infant's supernatural abilities manifested immediately as she reached toward her father with movements too coordinated for newborn physiology, her tiny fingers leaving brief impressions in metal bed rails that shouldn't have yielded to pressure from someone who weighed barely 6 pounds. Maya held her daughter with wonder that mixed maternal love with scientific fascination as she observed capabilities that exceeded both human and vampire children in their pure forms, hybrid genetics that had produced something unprecedented in supernatural evolution. Elena's presence in the room activated dormant magical signatures in objects that had shown no previous supernatural sensitivity. Wooden furniture glowing faintly with Celtic runes, while medical equipment displayed readings that suggested she existed partially outside normal physical laws. But her most remarkable ability became apparent when visitors arrived to meet the child who represented the future of vampire-human cooperation. Elena could perceive both human and supernatural worlds simultaneously, her enhanced senses showing her the golden threads that connected all supernatural beings, while also seeing the emotional auras that surrounded purely human individuals. She reached equally toward Agent Rivera and Counselor Vesper, showing no preference for vampire or human contact, while demonstrating innate understanding of both species' emotional and supernatural signatures. Maya watched her daughter's interactions with growing realization that Elena would never face the choice between worlds that had defined her own struggle. The child's hybrid nature, allowing her to exist fully in both communities without the restrictions that bound even enhanced humans or transformed vampires. The implications of Elena's abilities rippled through both supernatural and human communities, as word spread about the first successful vampire-human hybrid in centuries. Vampire factions that had initially opposed Kieran's fertility restoration began approaching Maya with requests for similar hybrid children, recognizing that Elena's capabilities might represent evolutionary advancement rather than dangerous aberration. Human government agencies expressed interest in studying Elena's development, while Maya fought to protect her daughter's childhood from scientific scrutiny that would treat her as experiment rather than child. The competing demands from both species forced Maya and Kieran to establish protective protocols that would shield Elena while acknowledging the legitimate scientific and political interest her existence had generated among communities desperate for advancement beyond their current limitations. Maya's experience navigating supernatural politics and human institutions made her uniquely qualified to design educational frameworks that would prepare Elena and future hybrid children for their dual heritage. The school they established occupied buildings that straddled the boundary between human and supernatural territories, physical space that reflected the bridging role their students would play in communities that had coexisted through separation rather than integration. Maya insisted on curriculum that taught both human academic subjects and supernatural cultural heritage, preparing hybrid children to understand and respect both sides of their genetic legacy, while developing abilities that surpassed either parent species. The educational program attracted attention from vampire families seeking advantages for their own bloodlines and human researchers studying genetic enhancement possibilities, creating waiting lists that forced Maya to expand the program beyond anything she'd originally envisioned. Kieran's support for the educational initiative surprised vampire traditionalists who expected him to use his restored fertility for political advantage rather than social reform, but his partnership with Maya had transformed his understanding of power from domination to collaboration. The school became model for supernatural human cooperation that influenced policy changes throughout both communities, demonstrating that integration could benefit everyone involved rather than threatening existing power structures through forced change. Maya found herself consulting on similar educational programs in other cities as hybrid births increased across the supernatural world. Her expertise in bridging communities, making her voice essential for policy development that would shape the next generation's relationships between species. Years passed with Maya establishing herself as authoritative voice in supernatural human relations, while Elena grew into abilities that continued to surprise both communities. The child could walk through spaces that existed between dimensional boundaries, visiting supernatural realms that remained hidden from pure humans while maintaining connection to mortal world that pure vampires couldn't sustain without transformation. Elena's playdates included vampire children whose enhanced strength couldn't match her hybrid agility and human children whose creativity complemented her supernatural perceptions in ways that produced innovations neither species had achieved alone. Maya watched her daughter navigate social dynamics that spanned species boundaries with ease that adults struggled to match. hybrid perspective that treated differences between communities as interesting variations rather than insurmountable obstacles. The golden thread that had once bound Maya to Kiran through supernatural compulsion had evolved into visible symbol of partnership they both could see. Supernatural connection that strengthened through choice rather than magical enforcement. Maya's role as bridge between worlds had expanded beyond her original family obligations to encompass responsibilities that would shape supernatural human relations for generations beyond her enhanced, but still finite lifespan. She maintained offices in both human government facilities and supernatural council chambers, consultant whose unique perspective informed policy decisions that affected millions of people who remained unaware of the immortal communities that shared their world. The fertility clinic where her journey had begun became center for supernatural medical research that combined vampire healing expertise with human scientific methodology, producing treatments that benefited both communities while advancing understanding of genetics that crossed species boundaries. Maya stood in the same sterile white room where everything had started, but now it served as consultation space in her clinic for supernatural medical research rather than desperate venue for selling genetic material to pay student loans. The mirror reflected not just her own face, but the faint runic markings that had become permanent features of her enhanced physiology, Celtic spirals that glowed softly when she used inherited abilities that commanded respect from both human colleagues and vampire political allies. Through the examination room window, she could see Elena playing in gardens where human and vampire children learned together under supervision from teachers whose own hybrid heritage prepared them for educational challenges that traditional schools couldn't address. The 12-year-old moved between groups with social grace that bridged differences her classmates barely noticed. Supernatural abilities manifesting as leadership skills that brought out the best qualities in both human creativity and vampire excellence. Maya smiled as she watched her daughter organize games that required both human imagination and supernatural coordination. Hybrid perspective that treated species differences as complementary strengths rather than competing limitations. Elena had never known the desperate financial circumstances that had driven Maya into supernatural entanglement, her childhood protected by resources that Vampire Political Alliance and Human Government Consulting had provided through legitimate channels rather than manipulative positioning. But Maya remained vigilant about protecting her daughter's agency, ensuring that Elena's remarkable abilities would develop through choice and education, rather than external pressure from communities that might view her hybrid nature as resource to be exploited rather than individual to be respected. The quiet afternoon in her clinic was interrupted by a soft knock on the examination room door that announced another consultation appointment. Maya's enhanced senses detected supernatural signature before the visitor entered, werewolf genetics carrying distinctive markers that her hybrid-trained perception could identify through closed doors. The young man who entered looked barely 18, his nervous energy suggesting desperation Maya recognized from her own supernatural introduction years earlier. His story unfolded with familiar themes of family bloodline curses and inherited supernatural obligations that had shaped his life through circumstances beyond his control. The werewolf pack he'd inherited leadership of faced genetic bottleneck that threatened their survival, ancient curse that required specific bloodline compatibility to break while maintaining pack bonds that kept their supernatural community stable. Maya listened with expertise born from years of navigating supernatural legal frameworks while maintaining human perspective that kept immortal problems grounded in moral considerations that protected individual agency. The consultation revealed that werewolf reproductive challenges paralleled vampire fertility issues in ways that suggested broader supernatural population crisis affecting multiple species who had maintained genetic isolation for too many generations. Maya's success with vampire-human hybrid fertility had established precedent that other supernatural communities hoped to apply to their own survival challenges, bridging programs that might prevent extinction through controlled integration rather than pure bloodline preservation. Her clinic had become destination for supernatural beings, seeking solutions that combine traditional magical approaches with modern genetic science, hybrid methodology that produced results neither approach could achieve independently. The werewolf's request opened new possibilities for expanding Maya's work beyond vampire communities toward comprehensive supernatural medical research that could address population challenges facing all immortal species. Maya scheduled follow-up appointments while her mind raced through implications of werewolf-human hybrid possibilities, genetic combinations that might produce abilities even more remarkable than Elena's vampire-enhanced heritage, while creating new challenges for communities that had never prepared for such fundamental changes to their species' limitations. As the young werewolf left with hope replacing the desperation he'd carried into her clinic, Maya realized her work bridging supernatural communities had only just begun. The success with vampire-human cooperation had established foundation for addressing supernatural population crises that threatened multiple species who had maintained separation rather than seeking solutions through collaboration. Maya's unique position as enhanced human with supernatural authority made her voice essential for policy development that would shape the future of multiple immortal communities whose survival depended on adaptation rather than tradition. Elena's laughter drifted through the clinic windows as Maya prepared for consultations that would expand her work beyond vampire relations toward comprehensive supernatural community medicine. Her daughter represented not just the future of vampire-human cooperation, but the possibility that hybrid heritage could bridge differences between all supernatural species and human communities. Evolutionary advancement that promised solutions to challenges that had seemed insurmountable through species isolation alone.